When a police officer tased an elderly black veteran at his wife's funeral, no one expected the Congressional Medal of Honor recipient to have General Patricia Mitchell's direct phone number. And the silence that fell when 30 Marines in dress blues took over the street changed everything. To understand the instant karma that happens, we need to go back to where this all started. The morning mist clung to Arlington National Cemetery like tears streamed silently down the nation's face. Staff Sergeant Robert Bobby Washington, 73, stood in his dress blues, the same uniform he'd worn 47 years ago when he returned from Vietnam to protests and spitting crowds. Today, those same blues trembled slightly as his weathered hands adjusted the American flag draped over his wife Margaret's casket. Margaret Washington had been his anchor for 51 years. She'd waded through 2 tours in Vietnam, held him through nightmares that lasted decades, and raised their 3 children, while he served his country in ways he could never fully explain. Now, at Mount Olivet Cemetery in their hometown of Riverside, California, Bobby faced the heartbreakingly quiet determination of saying goodbye to the woman who'd made him whole. The small funeral procession moved slowly through the morning air. Bobby's grandson Marcus, 19 and fresh out of Marine boot camp, walked beside the hearse in his own dress blues. 3 other Marines from the local recruiting station had volunteered to serve as honor guard, a genuinely moving silence falling over them as they prepared for the final farewell. But Bobby Washington carried secrets that morning. Secrets about a night in 1971 near the DMZ when he'd saved 17 Marines from an enemy ambush. Secrets about the Congressional Medal of Honor tucked away in a shoebox, never displayed because Margaret said heroes didn't need to prove themselves to anyone. Secrets about the phone number in his wallet, a direct line to General Patricia Mitchell, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs who owed her life to a young sergeant's split-second decision in a jungle firefight. As the funeral procession approached the cemetery gates, Bobby noticed the Riverside police cruiser following too closely. Officer Derek Mason, 28, had been on the force for 6 years and carried his own secrets. A disciplinary record, thick with complaints about racial profiling patterns and a chief who'd grown tired of settling lawsuits. Mason saw an old black man in a military uniform and thought he saw someone trying too hard to look important. The hearse stopped at the cemetery entrance. Bobby stepped forward to help guide his wife's casket, his military bearing never forgotten despite the arthritis that made every step painful. His grandson Marcus and the 3 Marines moved with precision, their white gloves gleaming in the morning sun. That's when Officer Mason's radio crackled. Suspicious gathering at Mount Olivet Cemetery, possible gang activity involving individuals in military-style clothing. Mason looked at Bobby Washington, a black veteran helping to carry his wife's casket, and saw what his training and prejudice told him to see, a threat. The silence that fell when Mason stepped out of his cruiser would change everything. Officer Derek Mason approached the funeral procession with his hand resting on his service weapon. His body camera rolled, capturing every word, every gesture, every moment that would later be dissected by Internal Affairs, the FBI, and millions of Americans who believed that badge doesn't equal immunity. "Sir, I need to see some identification," Mason called out, his voice cutting through the utterly devastating accusation of suspicion hanging in the morning air. Bobby Washington looked up from his wife's casket, his eyes filled with unshed tears that had nothing to do with grief over Margaret and everything to do with a lifetime of moments like this. Moments when his service meant nothing, when his sacrifice was invisible, when his dignity was questioned by those sworn to protect and serve. "Officer, we're conducting a funeral service," Bobby said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his eyes. "This is my wife, Margaret. She passed 3 days ago. Mason's training had taught him to escalate rather than de-escalate when dealing with what his department unofficially called attitude. He saw Bobby's composed response as defiance rather than dignity. Behind him, funeral attendees began to gather. Margaret's sister Rose, their neighbor Mrs. Chen, who'd brought casseroles for 30 years, and Pastor Williams from the Baptist church where Margaret had played piano every Sunday. "I don't care what you're doing," Mason snapped, his voice carrying across the cemetery like a slap. "When I ask for ID, you produce ID. Now." Marcus Washington, Bobby's grandson, stepped forward. At 19, he'd already learned about constitutional rights violated in his high school civics class. He'd sworn an oath just weeks ago to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. His dress blues were pristine, his bearing perfect, his respect for authority absolute, until that authority disrespected the flag his grandfather had bled for. "Sir, with respect," Marcus said, his young voice trembling with controlled anger. "My grandfather is burying his wife. He's a Vietnam veteran. We're conducting a military funeral." Mason's hand moved closer to his weapon. "I didn't ask you, boy. I asked him." The word boy hit the gathered mourners like a physical blow. Mrs. Chen gasped. Pastor Williams stepped forward, his own hands raised peacefully. Rose Washington began recording with her phone, her fingers shaking as she captured what she knew was about to become evidence. Bobby Washington had faced enemy fire in Southeast Asia. He'd led men through hell and brought them home alive. He'd earned respect through blood and sacrifice and decades of service to a country that had never quite learned to love him back. But standing over his wife's casket, facing a young officer who saw threat where there should have been honor, Bobby felt the completely humiliating moment of being reduced to a stereotype in an unbearably lonely moment where dignity met prejudice. Slowly, with the dignity that had carried him through 50 years of such moments, Bobby reached for his wallet. His movements were deliberate, careful, the movements of a man who'd learned that sudden gestures could be fatal for someone who looked like him. That's when Mason drew his taser. "Get on the ground! Now!" The command echoed across the cemetery like gunfire. Time moved differently in the seconds before everything collapsed. Bobby Washington, 73 years old and trembling with grief, looked down at the taser pointed at his chest and saw 50 years of American promises broken in a single moment. His wife's casket sat between him and Officer Mason like an altar to all the things that should have been sacred. "Please," Bobby whispered, his voice carrying decades of dignity under assault. "I'm burying my wife." But Derek Mason had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His finger moved to the trigger, his training screaming at him that compliance through force was the only language these people understood. Behind him, backup units were already en route. He'd called for assistance dealing with what he'd reported as aggressive subjects refusing to comply at cemetery disturbance. Marcus Washington watched his grandfather, a man who'd never raised his voice, never raised his hand, never been anything but a pillar of quiet strength, standing helpless before an officer who saw only color and threat. The young Marine's oath echoed in his mind. "I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." "Grandfather," Marcus said quietly, his voice cold and calculating with the precision of military training, "step back." But Bobby Washington had spent 73 years stepping back, stepping aside, making himself smaller to make others comfortable. Today, over Margaret's casket, something inside him refused to bend. "I've served this country for 27 years, Bobby said, his voice gaining strength from depths Mason couldn't comprehend. "I bled for this flag. I buried friends for this Constitution, and I will not be degraded at my wife's funeral." Mason fired the taser. 50,000 volts coursed through Bobby Washington's body as he collapsed beside his wife's casket. His dress blues, the same uniform he'd worn to receive his third Purple Heart, twisted as he convulsed on the cemetery grass. The American flag on Margaret's casket fluttered in the morning breeze, the silence that fell more deafening than any battlefield Bobby had ever known. Marcus Washington, trained Marine, loving grandson and witness to an atrocity, pulled out his phone with hands that shook with righteous fury. His first call went to 911. His second call went to his unit commander. His third call went to a number his grandfather had made him memorize years ago, just in case. General Mitchell's office. His is urgent. Rose Washington's phone continued recording as Pastor Williams dropped to his knees beside Bobby's convulsing form. Mrs. Chen wept openly. The other Marines from the honor guard stood frozen, their training warring with their conscience as they watched a brother-in-arms brutalized while honoring his fallen wife. Officer Mason stood over Bobby Washington's body, his taser still drawn, his career already over, though he didn't know it yet. Behind him, 3 more squad cars arrived with sirens wailing, backup for what would be recorded as resisting arrest at a public disturbance. But Marcus Washington's phone calls had already set other wheels in motion. At Camp Pendleton, 40 miles away, phones were ringing. At the Pentagon, 3,000 miles away, a 4-star general was being briefed on an assault against one of her most decorated veterans. And in Washington, D.C., the machinery of federal investigation launched was beginning to turn. 7 minutes. That's how long it would take for everything to change. Bobby Washington lay unconscious beside his wife's casket, his body still twitching from electrical shock, his honor under assault by the very system he'd sworn to defend. But the young Marine standing guard over him, his grandson, had made the calls that would bring justice thundering down like an avenging angel. The street was about to belong to the Marines. At Camp Pendleton, Marine Corps Base, Colonel James Rodriguez was reviewing training schedules when his aide burst through the door with urgency that could only mean one thing: a Marine was in trouble. "Sir, we have a situation. Staff Sergeant Washington, Vietnam veteran, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, was just fired on the spot from his dignity by police at his wife's funeral." Rodriguez felt the words hit him like incoming artillery. He'd served with men who'd served with Bobby Washington. The Medal of Honor was sacred ground in the Corps. There were only 81 living recipients, and every Marine knew their names like prayers. "Get me everything," Rodriguez commanded, his voice sharp with command authority, "and get me General Mitchell's office. Now." 40 miles away in Riverside, Marcus Washington knelt beside his grandfather's unconscious form while Officer Mason attempted to justify the unjustifiable to his arriving backup units. The young Marine's phone buzzed continuously. Text messages from his unit, calls from his commanding officer, and one message that made his hands shake. "General Mitchell en route via helicopter, ETA 7 minutes. Hold fast, Marine." At the Pentagon, General Patricia Mitchell, the first black woman to serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was climbing into a military helicopter that would carry her to Southern California faster than any commercial flight could manage. 47 years ago, a young sergeant named Bobby Washington had dragged her wounded body 300 yards through enemy fire, never leaving her behind despite taking shrapnel that would earn him his 3rd Purple Heart. She'd built her career on the foundation of that night, rising through ranks in an organization that hadn't always welcomed women or people of color. Every star on her collar carried the weight of Bobby Washington's sacrifice, and every decision she'd made in 4 decades of service honored the debt she could never fully repay. "Ma'am," her aide said through the helicopter's intercom, "we have local law enforcement claiming the veteran was resisting arrest." General Mitchell's voice cut through the rotor noise like a blade. "That veteran's name is Staff Sergeant Robert Washington. He holds the Congressional Medal of Honor for actions that saved 17 Marines, including me. And if anyone thinks they can brutalize him at his wife's funeral, they're about to learn what systematic corruption exposed looks like when the full weight of the United States military takes interest." Back at Mount Olivet Cemetery, EMTs had arrived and were working to stabilize Bobby Washington. The taser's effects were wearing off, but the 73-year-old veteran's heart was struggling with the shock. Pastor Williams held Bobby's hand while Rose Washington continued recording everything, her phone now live streaming to Facebook where the video was being shared at viral speeds. Officer Mason stood apart from the growing crowd, finally beginning to understand that something had gone catastrophically wrong. His radio crackled with traffic that made his blood run cold. "All units, be advised, we have federal interest in the cemetery incident. FBI en route. Military personnel en route. Chief wants all officers to stand down and secure the scene." The federal investigation launched was about to arrive with the thunderous precision of military justice. Marcus Washington looked up from his grandfather's side as the distinctive sound of military helicopters filled the California sky. 3 aircraft approached in formation. General Mitchell's command helicopter, flanked by 2 transport birds, carrying a full platoon of Marines in dress blues. "Grandfather," Marcus whispered, his voice carrying 47 years of delayed justice, "thank you for your service is coming." The helicopters touched down in the cemetery parking lot with military precision that made the assembled police officers step back instinctively. General Patricia Mitchell emerged from the lead aircraft, her 4 stars gleaming in the morning sun, her face carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded troops in 3 combat zones and sat at the right hand of presidents. Behind her, 30 Marines in dress blues formed up with movements so precise they looked choreographed. Each man and woman had volunteered for this mission within minutes of hearing that a Medal of Honor recipient had been assaulted at his wife's funeral. They represented every background, every region, every dream that America had ever promised its children, and they were completely unacceptable behavior made manifest in blue uniforms and white gloves. Officer Derek Mason watched the military formation approach and felt his world collapsing in real time. His radio crackled with panicked communications from dispatch. "All units, federal jurisdiction is being asserted. FBI field office has assumed command of the incident." General Mitchell walked directly to Bobby Washington, who was now conscious and sitting up with EMT assistants. The 4-star general, one of the most powerful people in America, knelt beside the elderly veteran with tears in her eyes that she didn't try to hide. "Bobby," she said softly, her voice carrying decades of gratitude and friendship. "I came as fast as I could." Bobby Washington looked up at the woman whose life he'd saved in a jungle firefight when she was a 2nd lieutenant, and he was a staff sergeant with more courage than common sense. The silence that fell over the cemetery was absolute as 2 warriors, separated by rank but united by sacrifice, shared a moment that transcended every barrier America had ever built. "Patricia," Bobby whispered, his voice still shaky from the taser's effects, "they... at Margaret's funeral." "I know," General Mitchell replied, her voice pure ice as she stood and turned toward Officer Mason. "And it ends now." The transformation was immediate and total. Marcus Washington watched in silence as his grandfather's honor was restored by the very system that had moments ago brutalized him. The Marines formed an honor guard around Margaret's casket, their precision and dignity making the police presence look exactly like what it was: systematic racism exposed in uniform. FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter, who'd grown up eating Margaret Washington's cookies and listening to Bobby's war stories, arrived with a full investigative team. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The little girl who'd played in the Washingtons' backyard was now the federal agent tasked with ensuring justice for her surrogate grandfather. "Officer Mason," Agent Chen announced, her voice carrying federal authority, "you're under investigation for civil rights violation under Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code. You have the right to remain silent." Mason's career didn't just end. it exploded like a roadside bomb, taking with it his pension, his reputation, and his freedom. The body camera footage that was supposed to protect him instead became evidence of everything wrong with a system that had forgotten the difference between service and oppression. General Mitchell turned to address the growing crowd of media, community members, and law enforcement officials who'd gathered to witness history being made in real time. Her eyes fixed on the cameras that would broadcast this moment to millions of Americans hungry for justice. Staff Sergeant Robert Washington is a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient who served this nation with distinction for 27 years, she announced, her voice carrying across the cemetery like a command from on high. Today, he was brutalized while honoring his wife at her funeral. This assault on a decorated veteran represents everything we swore to defend against. The Marines began the funeral service that Officer Mason had interrupted. Margaret Washington's casket was carried by hands that had sworn the same oath her husband had taken 50 years ago. The American flag was folded with precision that spoke to honor transcending color, with dignity overcoming hatred, with justice, system accountability finally living up to its promise. Bobby Washington stood beside his grandson as his wife was laid to rest with the honor she deserved. General Mitchell presented him with a flag that had flown over the Pentagon, a flag that carried the respect of a grateful nation and the promise that badge doesn't equal immunity when it comes between America and her heroes. The street belonged to the Marines now, and justice had finally come to Mount Olivet Cemetery. Within hours of Agent Chen's arrest of Officer Mason, the video of Bobby Washington being tased at his wife's funeral had exploded across social media with the force of moral outrage meeting digital acceleration. Rose Washington's live stream had been viewed 12 million times, shared by celebrities, politicians, and ordinary Americans who recognized injustice when they saw it. Tears streamed silently down a nation's digital face. The hashtag #HonorOurVeterans began trending worldwide as people learned Bobby Washington's full story. Military bloggers dug into Pentagon archives and discovered the classified report from 1971 detailing how Staff Sergeant Washington had single-handedly held off enemy forces while evacuating 17 wounded Marines, including a young Lieutenant Patricia Mitchell. CNN's Anderson Cooper opened his evening broadcast with the video, his voice heavy with controlled anger. Tonight, we examine what happens when constitutional rights violated meets viral video, when social media becomes the court of last resort for justice denied. But the real earthquake was happening in police departments across America. Officer Mason's history of complaints, previously buried in administrative files, was now front-page news. Internal affairs investigators discovered a pattern of racial profiling patterns that stretched back to his academy training, covered up by supervisors who valued silence over justice. The revelation shocked the whole room when federal investigators presented their findings to the Riverside City Council. FBI Special Agent Chen worked through the night, building a case that would ripple through federal courts for years. Her investigation revealed that the Riverside Police Department had paid out $2.3 million in brutality settlements over the past 5 years. Money that could have funded community programs, veteran services, or police reform training. At Camp Pendleton, Colonel Rodriguez found himself fielding calls from Marine units across the globe. Active duty Marines were requesting permission to attend Bobby Washington's wife's memorial service. Veterans were organizing honor guards. The community stands together phenomenon was spreading like wildfire through military networks that spanned decades and continents. General Mitchell used her position to ensure that Bobby Washington's story reached the highest levels of government. She personally briefed the Secretary of Defense, who briefed the President, who authorized a full Department of Justice investigation into systematic corruption exposed within the Riverside Police Department. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus Washington, still in his dress blues, stood before the cameras and spoke with the controlled passion of a young Marine who'd seen his grandfather's honor attacked and restored in the same morning. My grandfather never told us about his Medal of Honor, Marcus said, his voice carrying across a nation hungry for heroes. He never bragged about his service. He just lived it, every day, with quiet dignity. Yesterday, that dignity was violated. Today, it was restored. Tomorrow, we make sure it never happens again. The video of Marcus's statement was shared 40 million times in 24 hours. Marine recruiting stations reported record numbers of inquiries. American Dream Defended became more than a hashtag. It became a movement. Pastor Williams organized a community meeting at the Baptist church where Margaret had played piano. The sanctuary overflowed with neighbors, veterans, active duty military, and ordinary Americans who'd driven hours to show support. Mrs. Chen spoke about the Bobby Washington who'd shoveled her driveway for 30 years. Rose Washington shared stories of Margaret's quiet kindness. Agent Chen discussed the federal investigation that would ensure accountability. The institutional transformation required was beginning at the grassroots level, powered by viral video and sustained by a community that had finally found its voice. Officer Mason, suspended without pay and facing federal charges, watched his life unravel in real time. His wife filed for divorce. His children were removed from their school due to harassment. The thin blue line that was supposed to protect him had dissolved the moment his actions went viral, leaving him to face the consequences of choices that seemed reasonable right up until the world was watching. But America was watching too, and America was remembering what it means to honor our service members, to protect dignity, and to ensure that thank you for your service means something more than empty words at a football game. The climactic, emotional pause came when the White House issued a statement condemning the assault and promising federal action to protect veterans' rights. The transformation was just beginning. 3 weeks after Margaret Washington's funeral, the ripple effects of that morning continued expanding like shock waves from a moral earthquake. Officer Derek Mason sat in a federal holding cell, his bail denied after prosecutors argued he was a flight risk with access to weapons and a demonstrated willingness to use violence against vulnerable citizens. His wife's divorce papers had been served the day after his arrest. His children were staying with their parents, their last name already changed to avoid association with their father's crimes. The house he'd bought with a police officer's salary was in foreclosure, his legal bills consuming every asset he'd accumulated in 6 years of law enforcement. But Mason's personal destruction was just the beginning of a systematic investigation reveals deeper problems that reached into every corner of the Riverside Police Department. FBI agents had seized decades of personnel files, discovering a pattern of complaints, cover-ups, and cultural rot that made Mason's assault on Bobby Washington look like a symptom rather than an isolated incident. Chief Robert Martinez, a 30-year veteran who'd risen through ranks that rewarded loyalty over integrity, found himself testifying before a federal grand jury about decisions that had seemed reasonable when made in closed-door meetings but looked like conspiracy when displayed on courtroom screens. Chief Martinez, federal prosecutor Janet Torres asked, her voice cutting through the courtroom's tension, "Were you aware that Officer Mason had received 14 citizen complaints in 6 years of service?" "Some complaints are unavoidable in police work," Martinez replied, his voice lacking the conviction that had once commanded respect. "Were you aware that 13 of those complaints involved allegations of racial profiling patterns and excessive force?" The silence stretched until it became an admission. Agent Sarah Chen's investigation had uncovered a culture where complaints against officers like Mason were routinely dismissed, where victims were intimidated into dropping charges, where the badge had become a shield against accountability rather than a symbol of service. Bobby Washington, recovered from his physical injuries but still processing the emotional trauma, testified before Congress about the assault that had changed his life and threatened to change America's conversation about police accountability. "Senators," Bobby said, his voice steady despite the powerfully silent witness he'd become for millions of Americans, "I didn't survive Vietnam to be brutalized at my wife's funeral. I didn't earn my medals to have my dignity stripped away by someone who swore the same oath I did, to protect and serve." Senator Elizabeth Warren, chairwoman of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Rights, leaned forward. "Staff Sergeant Washington, what do you want to see come from this tragedy?" Bobby's answer became the foundation for what would become the Washington Act, federal legislation requiring body cameras, civilian oversight boards, and mandatory de-escalation training for all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding. "I want my grandson Marcus to serve his country without wondering if his uniform will protect him or make him a target," Bobby replied. "I want community stands together to mean something more than hashtags and viral videos." General Mitchell, testifying alongside Bobby, provided the military perspective that gave congressional conservatives permission to support police reform without appearing anti-law enforcement. "Senators," she said, her 4 stars catching television lights, "in the military, we understand that with authority comes accountability. When a service member violates their oath, they face court-martial. When they disgrace their uniform, they answer to military justice. Police officers deserve the same system of accountability that maintains honor in our armed forces." The federal oversight required was no longer a progressive dream. It was a bipartisan necessity endorsed by the nation's highest-ranking military officer. Marcus Washington, now serving as his grandfather's aide and advocate, watched the congressional hearing from the gallery. The young Marine had received orders for Iraq, but General Mitchell had intervened to assign him to the Pentagon, where he could continue advocating for veterans' rights while serving his country. "Grandfather," Marcus whispered during a recess, "Margaret would be proud." Bobby nodded, thinking of his wife who'd supported him through decades of service and sacrifice. Institutional transformation required had become their legacy, carved from the ashes of her funeral and built on the foundation of his refusal to surrender dignity even when facing a taser. Outside the Capitol building, veterans groups were organizing. Police reform advocates were marching. Truth finally revealed was becoming system held accountable, one congressional vote at a time. Officer Mason's trial was scheduled for the following month, but his fate was already sealed. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, the video undeniable. His career-ending mistake revealed had become America's teachable moment about the difference between justice and revenge, between accountability and persecution. The transformation was accelerating. The federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles had never seen anything like the crowd that gathered for United States v. Derek Mason. Veterans in dress uniforms stood alongside community activists. Marines from Camp Pendleton had received permission to attend in solidarity with their Medal of Honor recipient. FBI agents who'd built the case watched from the gallery as months of investigation faced the test of 12 American jurors. Bobby Washington, wearing his dress blues with every ribbon and medal earned over 27 years of service, walked slowly into the courtroom with Marcus beside him. The elderly veteran's dignity had been restored, but the memory of lying convulsing beside his wife's casket remained etched in his consciousness and captured forever on video that had been viewed by over 100 million people worldwide. Federal prosecutor Janet Torres opened her case with the simplicity that made truth undeniable. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about what happens when a badge becomes a weapon against the very citizens it's meant to protect." On the morning of September 15th, Staff Sergeant Robert Washington was conducting his wife's funeral when Officer Derek Mason decided that this decorated veteran was a threat that needed to be eliminated. The prosecution's case was built on irrefutable evidence. Rose Washington's cell phone video showed every moment from Mason's initial approach to Bobby's collapse beside Margaret's casket. Body camera footage from Mason's own uniform captured his escalating aggression, his dismissal of explanations, his decision to use electrical force against a grieving widower. Defense attorney Michael Rodriguez, appointed by the court after Mason's assets were frozen, attempted to argue that his client had acted according to training and perceived threat, but every witness called to support that argument instead revealed the systematic corruption exposed within the Riverside Police Department. Officer Mason responded to reports of suspicious activity, Rodriguez argued. He had no way of knowing the individuals were conducting a legitimate funeral service. Prosecutor Torres destroyed that argument with surgical precision. The defendant saw a hearse, a casket, mourners in funeral attire, and active-duty Marines in dress blues conducting an honor guard. What exactly was suspicious about a military funeral in a cemetery? Bobby Washington's testimony became the emotional center of the trial. The elderly veteran spoke with quiet dignity about his service, his wife's death, and the morning when he'd been reduced to a convulsing body on cemetery grass while trying to honor the woman who'd stood by him for 51 years. Officer Mason looked at me and saw a threat, Bobby testified, his voice steady despite the tears streamed silently from spectators throughout the courtroom. I looked at Officer Mason and saw someone who'd forgotten what the uniform is supposed to represent. Agent Sarah Chen's testimony revealed the investigation that had uncovered Mason's history of complaints, the department's pattern of ignoring abuse, and the federal violations that made this case about much more than one officer's bad decision. We discovered that Officer Mason had used his taser 7 times in 6 years, Agent Chen testified. 6 of those incidents involved African American suspects, 5 resulted in hospitalization. 0 resulted in disciplinary action. The defense's key witness, Police Chief Martinez, proved more damaging than helpful when cross-examination revealed the administrative culture that had enabled Mason's behavior. Chief Martinez, Torres asked, how many of Officer Mason's 14 complaints resulted in suspension or retraining? Officers receive counseling and additional training when appropriate, Martinez replied. How many resulted in suspension or retraining? Torres repeated. None that resulted in formal discipline. So 14 complaints over 6 years, 13 involving allegations of racial bias and excessive force, and your department's response was to do nothing? The silence that followed became evidence more powerful than any witness statement. Marcus Washington watched from the gallery as his grandfather's dignity was officially restored through the legal system that had initially failed him. The young Marine had received his deployment orders to Iraq, but he would leave knowing that justice had been served for the man who'd taught him what honor truly meant. General Mitchell, seated beside Bobby in the gallery, represented not just military support, but institutional acknowledgement that constitutional rights violated could not be tolerated regardless of the perpetrator's uniform. When the jury returned after 4 hours of deliberation, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all federal charges including civil rights violations, assault under color of law, and conspiracy to deprive civil rights. Officer Derek Mason would spend the next 8 years in federal prison, his pension eliminated, his future destroyed by decisions made in 7 minutes that revealed the character he'd hidden behind a badge. Judge Patricia Wong's sentencing statement became a judicial landmark. Officer Mason, you turned a funeral into a crime scene, dignity into degradation, and service into oppression. Your actions violated not just the law, but the social contract that allows law enforcement to function in a free society. This discrimination lawsuit, filed by the Washington family, has exposed systematic corruption exposed within your department that demands federal oversight required to prevent future violations. Outside the courthouse, Bobby Washington spoke to the gathered media with the same quiet strength that had carried him through decades of service and injustice. Today, the system worked. Justice was served. But justice isn't just about punishment. It's about ensuring this never happens again to another veteran, another family, another community that deserves better. Truth finally revealed that system held accountable is possible when good people refuse to remain silent. The ultimate justice satisfaction was not revenge, but redemption. The promise that America could still live up to its ideals when citizens demanded accountability from those who served in uniform. 6 months after Derek Mason's conviction, the transformation rippled outward like circles on water, touching lives and institutions far beyond a cemetery in Riverside, California. The former police officer began his 8-year federal sentence at a minimum security facility. His days structured around kitchen duty and anger management classes that were supposed to help him understand the destruction he'd caused. His wife had moved across the country with their children, starting over with her maiden name and a restraint order that kept Mason from contacting them. The house they'd bought during his years as a police officer was sold at auction, the proceeds going toward legal fees and restitution that would never fully compensate Bobby Washington for the trauma inflicted beside his wife's casket. But Mason's personal ruin was just the beginning of accountability that had grown beyond individual punishment into systematic reform. Chief Robert Martinez had resigned in disgrace after federal investigators discovered that departmental policies had systematically discouraged citizen complaints and protected abusive officers through a culture of silence and intimidation. The systematic reforms implemented began with the appointment of Chief Maria Santos, a 25-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department who had built her career on community policing and constitutional law enforcement. Her first act was implementing body cameras for every officer, civilian oversight boards for all complaints, and mandatory de-escalation training based on military rules of engagement. "Police work is not warfare," Chief Santos announced at her first press conference, standing before a backdrop that included photos of community leaders, veterans, and Bobby Washington receiving his Congressional Medal of Honor. "We serve communities, not occupy them. We protect rights, not violate them." The FBI's investigation had led to federal oversight of the Riverside Police Department under a consent decree that would last 5 years and cost the city $12 million in reforms, retraining, and restitution. Every officer would undergo bias training, constitutional law review, and community engagement requirements that transformed policing from enforcement to service. Agent Sarah Chen, promoted to Deputy Assistant Director for Civil Rights, used the Washington case as a template for investigating police departments across America. Her team had opened investigations in 17 cities where racial profiling patterns suggested systematic violations of civil rights protected by federal law. Bobby Washington had become an unlikely advocate for police reform, speaking at police academies, congressional hearings, and community meetings about the intersection of military service and civilian rights. His quiet dignity and undeniable heroism gave him credibility with audiences who might dismiss other voices calling for accountability. "I didn't serve my country to come home and be treated like an enemy," Bobby told a gathering of police chiefs in Washington, D.C., "but I also didn't earn my medals to see all officers painted as enemies either. Good police officers deserve better training, better leadership, and better systems that support constitutional law enforcement." Marcus Washington had completed his deployment to Iraq and returned home with his own service ribbon and a deeper understanding of what his grandfather had endured for decades. The young Marine was accepted to law school on a full scholarship, his goal to become a civil rights attorney specializing in veterans' issues. General Mitchell, now serving her final year as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had used the Washington case to strengthen ties between military and civilian law enforcement. Her initiative created exchange programs where police officers trained with military personnel on de-escalation, constitutional law, and the proper relationship between service members and civilian authority. The Washington Act had passed Congress with bipartisan support, establishing federal standards for police accountability that were backed by funding incentives and oversight mechanisms. Community healing and change was no longer just a slogan. It was federal law requiring citizen review boards, bias training, and transparency measures that made police departments accountable to the communities they served. Margaret Washington's grave had become an unofficial pilgrimage site for veterans, civil rights advocates, and ordinary Americans who understood that her husband's dignity had been restored through a legal system that finally worked as intended. Fresh flowers appeared weekly, left by strangers who'd learned about her story and wanted to honor the woman whose funeral had become a catalyst for national change. Pastor Williams had officiated at 17 weddings of couples who'd met at community meetings organized around police reform and veterans' rights. The Baptist church, where Margaret had played piano every Sunday, had become a community center where former adversaries worked together on solutions that honored both public safety and constitutional rights. Mrs. Chen, now 78, had lived to see her daughter lead the federal investigation that brought justice to her surrogate grandfather. She spent her afternoons at the senior center, teaching other elderly residents about their rights and the importance of recording police interactions, a skill she'd learned from watching Rose Washington's quick thinking save the day. The permanent institutional changes were measurable in statistics that told the story of transformation. Excessive force complaints in Riverside had dropped by 73% since the reforms began. Community trust in police, measured by annual surveys, had increased from 23% to 67% among African American residents. Most importantly, no veteran had been assaulted by police in California since the Washington Act became law. Officer Mason's former colleagues had scattered like seeds on wind. Some had embraced the reforms and become examples of constitutional policing. Others had resigned rather than submit to oversight and accountability. The thin blue line that had once protected abuse now protected citizens from abuse, exactly as it was supposed to work. The vindication, public justice served, was complete, but it had come at a cost measured in trauma, time, and trust that would take generations to fully rebuild. Bobby Washington carried the physical and emotional scars of 7 minutes that had changed everything, but he also carried the satisfaction of knowing that his suffering had prevented others from experiencing the same injustice. Hometown heroes recognized at last, not just for past service but for present courage in demanding accountability. 2 years after Margaret Washington's funeral, Bobby Washington stood in the same cemetery where his dignity had been stripped away and restored. But this time, he wasn't alone. 50 Marines in dress blue surrounded him, not as emergency responders, but as participants in the dedication of the Margaret Washington Veterans Memorial, a monument to service, sacrifice, and the ongoing fight for justice. The memorial featured a bronze statue of Margaret at her piano, her hands positioned over keys that would never again fill the Baptist church with hymns that had sustained a community through decades of struggle. Beside the statue, an eternal flame burned for all veterans who'd served their country only to face injustice at home. General Mitchell, now retired but still commanding respect in civilian clothes, spoke to the gathered crowd about the woman who'd never worn a uniform but had served her country by supporting the man who'd worn it with honor for 27 years. Margaret Washington understood that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform, the general said, her voice carrying across the cemetery where history had been made and remade. She understood that the inspirational vision of better future requires daily commitment to the values we swore to defend. Bobby Washington, now 75 and moving more slowly but still carrying himself with military bearing never forgotten, stepped forward to speak about the woman whose death had become a catalyst for national change. "Thank you for making me the man who could survive that morning and use it to help others." The community stands together was no longer a hashtag or a slogan. It was a living reality carved from tragedy and built on the foundation of an elderly veteran's refusal to surrender dignity even when facing a taser. The Marines who'd surrounded Bobby Washington that September morning had returned to their bases and their lives, but they'd carried with them the knowledge that "thank you for your service" meant something more than words when backed by actions that defended veterans' rights and dignity. As Bobby Washington walked slowly toward his car, supported by Marcus and surrounded by friends who'd become family, he carried the satisfaction of knowing that his suffering had not been meaningless. The system that had failed him had been forced to change. The officers who'd abused their authority had faced accountability, and the community that had rallied to his defense had learned that ordinary citizens could demand extraordinary justice when they stood together. The street no longer belonged to the Marines. It belonged to everyone who believed that America could be better than its worst moments, stronger than its deepest divisions, and more just than its most painful history. Margaret Washington's funeral had become America's awakening, and Bobby Washington's dignity had become the foundation for institutional transformation required that would protect veterans, citizens, and the Constitution for generations to come. The ultimate justice satisfaction was not revenge, but redemption. The promise that in America, even the most powerful institutions could be held accountable when citizens demanded that justice be more than a word carved in courthouse marble. Justice had come to Mount Olivet Cemetery, and it had never left. This story is dedicated to all veterans who have served their country with honor, all citizens who have demanded accountability from those in power, and all Americans who believe that justice delayed is not justice denied when good people refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice.